In the middle of a burning stable, a black horse collapses, blood pouring from its chest, yet still stands, shielding a 5-year-old girl trapped beneath a fallen beam. A man charges forward with a knife, but the horse does not retreat. And just as the blade slashes through the smoke, the girl's scream tears through the silence, dragging a buried truth into the light. Subscribe now and don't miss our hauntingly emotional cinematic story episodes. Under the thick, sullen sky of Camden, Maine, the world held its breath. The ocean below crashed in distant rhythm, its foam licking hungrily at the jagged cliffside like an animal awakening from a long, cold sleep. Dawn was not golden that morning. It was gray, bruised. The kind of dawn that makes even the bravest forget how to pray. Vincent Thorne didn't hesitate as he stepped over the brittle line of grass that marked the beginning of the rock ledge. His footsteps were deliberate, steady. In his arms, wrapped in a faded pink blanket dotted with stitched stars, was Maddie, 5 years old. Flaxen hair curled around her cheek, breathing in the soft, unconscious rhythm of a child in deep sleep. She didn't stir. Vincent's fingers calloused from the docks, and rough dealings gripped her a little too tightly. The edge was only 3 steps away now. The tide was in. He knelt, not to pray, not to beg forgiveness, just to lower her gently to the slab of damp stone beneath his knees. He set her down with meticulous care, like laying a porcelain doll back into its velvet case. The wind bit into his neck, and still he did not look back. Her small body shifted slightly as the breeze found its way into her blanket. Her hand clutching the corner of the fabric opened for a moment, revealing 2 small fingers stained with watercolor paint. She had been drawing that morning. He remembered a horse, of all things. Vincent's face twitched. He stood quickly. The last thing he wanted was to remember her voice, the one that squeaked, "Good morning" at sunrise, or her laugh when the cat at home brushed against her socked feet. He'd promised himself this would be fast, clean, efficient. One final glance not at her, but at the edge. The fog was thick today. Even if someone stumbled by, no one would see the small, slumped form in time. No one would hear the story. And even if they did, the story would be his. A terrible accident. He'd practiced it, rehearsed every detail. Her mother, gone 2 winters now, wouldn't be there to contradict him. And Maddie wouldn't remember. Or she wouldn't survive. Either outcome to him was acceptable. He turned. But the world did not let him go. A sound ripped through the haze, not human, not natural, something primal. A scream, but deeper, lower, coiled in something that was not rage, but something older, more dangerous. Vincent froze mid-step. It came again, a whinny, shrill and guttural, at once echoing off the cliff walls like a challenge or a warning. He turned slowly. On the far edge of the tree line where pine met stone stood a shape almost too still to be real. Thunder. His coat shimmered obsidian under mist muscles taut like wire beneath his soaked hide. Eyes like molten brass locked onto Vincent, not with curiosity, but with memory, the kind of memory that draws blood. For a moment, man and beast stared across 30 feet of distance and years of unresolved violence. Thunder didn't move, not yet, but his hooves shifted subtly on the stone. 1 step forward, then stillness. Vincent's throat tightened. It couldn't be him, not after what he did, not after the pit, the chain, the fire. He had watched that horse collapse, had heard the sickening crack of bone, had turned his back on the sound of dying and buried it under vodka and silence. But here he was. Thunder's ears flicked backward. The breeze shifted. Behind Vincent, Maddie stirred. Not a cry, just a murmur. Barely a sound. But Thunder heard it. The neck arched. The muscles bunched. Then came the stamp, loud, sharp final. A hoof met stone with a thunderous crack that split the fog like lightning. The impact echoed, and the imprint it left was violent, deep, and unmistakable. The first hoof mark. Vincent staggered backward instinctively. His hand moved to his coat pocket to the switchblade, the one he hadn't used in years but never left behind. But something in Thunder's stance made him stop. This wasn't a confrontation he'd survive, and Vincent knew in that one charged second that he was being watched not by Thunder alone, but by the land itself. The sea. The ghosts of every sin he'd left rotting along the coastline. He turned again, this time not slow but fast, retreating with the panic of a man who'd realized too late that some debts don't stay buried. The fog swallowed him within seconds. Thunder remained still. Maddie stirred again, a soft whimper caught in her throat as her body shifted. Her cheek touched the stone and recoiled from the cold. She turned in her blanket, a flicker of confusion in her sleeping face. Thunder approached, not like a predator, not like prey, but with the silent purpose of something old. Something watching the world decay and choosing still to protect. The sound of the sea swelled behind him. The tide was rising. The foam kissed the tips of Maddie's sneakers. A sharp wind sliced across the rocks, lifting the corners of the blanket, revealing her small, bird-like shoulders. Thunder moved closer. His breath was steam in the cold air. He lowered his head, touched the blanket with his muzzle, then lifted it with shocking gentleness, pulling it back over her shoulders. And then he did something stranger. He turned away, walked 3 paces, and stamped again, this time harder. Another hoof mark, a second scar carved into the living stone. He looked up at the sky. The clouds were bleeding light now, a silver rim etched around the outline of the morning sun. Thunder turned back to Maddie, lowered himself, sank slowly to his knees beside her, and waited. Behind them, the sea surged, but did not cross the line of hoofprints. Not yet. The story had begun. Under the pewter haze of early morning, the sky above Camden still hadn't decided if it would break open into sun or rain. A gust of salt wind howled low across the rocks. Maddie stirred. Her eyes fluttered open. Slowly, lashes crusted with the fine grit of seawater and sleep. And for a moment, she didn't see the sea or the sky or the stone beneath her. She saw only a blur. A moving blur. Dark. Still. Then she blinked, and the blur shaped itself into something real. A horse. A large black horse. Thunder stood barely 10 feet away, legs planted firm on the rock head, lowered slightly, not in aggression, not in fear, but in a kind of suspended judgment. He didn't move, didn't twitch. The wind raked across his mane, but he stood like a statue, as if even breathing would disturb the quiet. Maddie didn't scream, not because she wasn't afraid she was, but because her fear was so absolute, so full. It came out as silence. The kind of silence that collapses inward like a cave, losing its roof. Her small fingers gripped the edge of the blanket, her knees tucked under her, instinctively curling. A shiver ran through her. Cold, hunger, confusion, and the gut-punching terror of not knowing where she was or why. She looked around. No buildings, no road, no sound but the waves. Where was her house? Her bedroom? The mobile that hung above her bed. Where was Vincent? She didn't want him, but she wanted something. Someone. A single tear clung to her lower eyelid. It didn't fall. It froze there like her breath. Thunder didn't approach. He watched. The whites of his eyes showed faintly. Not in panic, but awareness. His body radiated tension, the kind of awareness horses possess when standing in the middle of lightning and waiting to decide if they'll run. Maddie sniffed. Her chin quivered. The tear fell. She didn't know what to do with him, this massive, dark, quiet thing. She didn't even know if he was real. Her mother had once read her a story about a black unicorn that appeared when children were brave, but she'd never believed it. Unicorns had horns. This one had eyes that looked too much like hers, scared and searching. Thunder took a step forward. Maddie flinched. He stopped, his breath fogged into the cold air between them. For a moment, the fog curled in a spiral like a ghost, trying to draw itself into words. Then he did the unthinkable. Thunder knelt, one leg, then the other. His chest lowered to the stone. His head dipped muzzle inches from the ground. He moved slowly, every gesture deliberate, grounded in a kind of solemnity, not servitude, but offering. It was not a trick, no performance. It was trust, or something like it. Maddie stared. The wind kicked up again, stronger this time, tugging at her blanket. She stood wobbling slightly and took a small, shuffling step toward him. Her feet were bare beneath the hem of her pajama bottoms, the soles red with cold. Thunder didn't move. She hesitated. The wind howled, and then slowly, almost not breathing, she reached out and touched his neck. Warm, alive, real. The muscle there twitched beneath her palm, like something tethered barely beneath the surface. She left her hand there, unsure of what else to do. Her lips parted, but no sound came. She hadn't spoken a word since waking. But her body did what children's bodies do when the mind is too overwhelmed to catch up. She sagged forward. Her cheek met his shoulder. She didn't collapse, not entirely. But she leaned as if her 5-year-old bones couldn't stand another second of carrying this new unknown world alone. Thunder exhaled. It sounded like smoke leaving a chimney after a long time gone. They stood like that for a moment that didn't belong to any clock. On the horizon, the fog began to lift, not fully, but enough to hint that the sun still existed somewhere above the ocean. Across town, a bell rang in the hallways of a small elementary school tucked behind the bakery on Chestnut Street. Rachel Clare glanced up from her desk at the sound her pencil stilling mid-checkmark. The morning had passed in a blur, spelling quizzes, milk cartons, shoelaces that needed tying. But something felt wrong, like a knot in the back of her throat that wouldn't swallow. She glanced down at the attendance sheet. Room 2B, 19 names, but only 18 boxes checked. Her eyes landed on the blank square next to Maddie Thorne. She frowned. It wasn't like Maddie to miss a day, let alone without a call from home. The little girl was always the first to arrive. Quiet, observant, the kind of child who watched more than she spoke. Rachel clicked her pen twice, then stared at the square again. She reached for her phone, stopped. Instead, she turned her head slowly toward the window, a large old pane of slightly rippled glass that looked out over the town's eastern side. And beyond that, the ocean. Gray, endless, gnawing at the edge of land with ancient hunger. The same wind that had tousled Maddie's hair now scraped at the school's siding, rattling a loose gutter near the window. Rachel stood, walked slowly to the window, put her hand flat against the glass. She didn't know why. Couldn't explain the coil of unease, tightening in her gut, the sudden acceleration of her heart. But she stared toward the cliffs, and something inside her, something she hadn't trusted in years, whispered, "She's not home." Back on the cliff, Maddie sat beside Thunder now. The warmth of his body was the only comfort she had. The fog had thinned enough for her to see the line of trees behind them, distant, unfamiliar. She wrapped the blanket tighter around herself. Thunder stood slowly with the poise of something ancient. He turned his head, looked at her, then began to walk. Not away, but past her, towards the trees. He stopped, looked back. Maddie stared at him. She didn't know what it meant, but she knew the difference between being left and being invited. And Thunder wasn't leaving. He was waiting, so she stood. The blanket trailed behind her, her feet still bare, still red. She hesitated only once, then followed. One step, two, three, and the distance between girl and beast closed not in steps, but in understanding. She didn't ask where they were going. She only knew it was not back. Under the thick canopy of the Camden pines, Thunder moved like a shadow. The forest was silent, not peaceful but expectant. Every rustle of branch and crack of twig beneath Thunder's hooves echoed in a space that felt too large and too still. It was the kind of quiet that lives in places touched by violence. Maddie lay across Thunder's back, her arms wrapped around the base of his neck. Her cheek rested against his mane. The rhythm of his stride, heavy, deliberate, and slow, became her lullaby. She wasn't asleep, but she was deeper than alert, deeper than thought. Something in her small body had surrendered to him, and something in him, a beast that had never let anything near, had opened just wide enough for one girl. They passed between tree trunks blackened with age and storm. Some snapped clean in half from old winds. The fog had lifted slightly, letting in threads of muted light that cut through the needles like silver blades. Thunder's ears twitched. He stopped. They stood before a clearing narrow and lined with old barbed wire posts half buried in moss. Maddie blinked and sat up. It looked like nothing at first. Just trees and ground and cold. But Thunder didn't move. Then Maddie saw it. A flash of metal glinting weakly in the pine mulch. Wire, rust red, wrapped in loops around the base of a tree. The tree bark bore deep gouges, black and gray, with rot. She followed the line of the wire with her eyes. More posts, more loops, a grid like a forgotten cage, and at the center a pile. She thought it was a fallen log, but then Thunder moved toward it, slowly. Maddie squinted. It wasn't a log. It was bones, bleached, cracked, and still partially draped in the remnants of skin and coarse black fur, peeled back from time and scavengers. A dead horse. Its skull tilted to the side, one eye socket yawning into the dirt, the other filled with pine needles. Its rib cage splayed like broken wings. Around its leg, fused now by rust and rain, was a loop of wire tight enough to have crushed bone. Thunder stood still. He didn't sniff. He didn't nudge. He simply stood. Maddie slid down from his back without thinking. Her feet touched the moss, and she stepped closer. The smell wasn't strong anymore, just the dry sweetness of decay and metal. She crouched near the hoof. It was cracked, but intact, and on its underside a small mark. A groove shaped like a lightning bolt, exactly like Thunder's. Maddie looked from the corpse to the stallion beside her. She didn't know what words to give this. Didn't have the vocabulary to explain the surge in her chest. It wasn't fear. It was grief. Raw, inherited, secondhand, but hers now. A sound left her mouth thin, high, helpless. Then another, until suddenly her face was buried in her hands, and she was sobbing hard and loud and without air. Thunder didn't move. He let her cry. And if the whites of his eyes gleamed brighter than before, it wasn't just the cold. Maddie knelt in the moss, crying beside the body of a horse whose name she would never know, and Thunder stood watch. As if to say, yes, there was another, but I am still here. Rachel sat alone in the faculty lounge, the last mug of coffee going cold in her hand. The kids were at recess. The hallway clocks ticked like hammers. She didn't want to believe it. Didn't want to let herself imagine the worst. But her gut had spoken. That old shriveled muscle inside her chest that used to pulse with certainty back when she believed people still cared. She opened the school's database, typed Maddie Thorne. The screen pulled up her file, kindergarten room 2B. Guardianship Vincent Thorne. Emergency contact none. Rachel stared. There were no notes, no incidents, no signs. Maddie had never cried in class. had never acted out. She had just watched, always watching. Rachel clicked open the expanded profile. It was empty. No medical records, no psychological assessments, no speech screening, just a few grades high marks and a scanned birth certificate. Then in a moment that didn't feel like hers, Rachel opened a private tab on her browser. She typed Vincent Thorne and Maine records. It was something she'd never done before. Something she might lose her job for. But that didn't stop her. The search results were shallow at first. A couple real estate listings, a DUI charge from 10 years ago. Then one line caught her eye, a local newspaper archive from 3 years back. The article title read, "Smuggling Ring Investigated in Camden, No Charges Filed." She clicked. Her eyes scanned. Vincent Thorne, local dock worker. Questioned in connection with a suspected child transport route using fishing vessels to move undocumented minors through the Maine coastline. No indictments. Lack of evidence. Rachel's fingers curled. No charges filed, but the article had a photo. Blurry, grainy. But Vincent was there, leaning against the side of a boat, smiling. And beside him, a man Rachel recognized. One of the school's former substitute teachers, disappeared last winter. No explanation. She closed her laptop slowly. The hallway outside was silent. The kids were coming back soon. She rose from her chair, walked over to the window. Far beyond the schoolyard, past the rooftops, beyond the trees, the ocean breathed. She thought of Maddie, the silence, the drawings of horses, the way she'd once whispered. Sometimes he closes the door so no one sees. Rachel hadn't known what that meant. Now her stomach was ice. She picked up the phone. Not to call the police. Not yet. Instead, she called Elijah. Back in the forest, Maddie lay curled beside the bones. Not touching them, just near. Thunder lay beside her, his massive body warm against the frozen earth. Her crying had slowed. What replaced it was quieter, but deeper. The kind of ache that stays in the throat long after tears dry. She touched the lightning-shaped groove on the dead hoof again, then looked at Thunder. He did not look back at her. He was staring at the trees, watching something she couldn't see, or maybe remembering something she'd never know. But his body shifted slightly closer. His breath warm and deep brushed her hair. And for a moment, Maddie closed her eyes. Not because she was tired, but because it hurt less than looking. The sirens didn't wail. They never did in places like this. 2 squad cars pulled into Vincent Thorne's gravel driveway, with the soft crackle of tires over stone headlights cutting across the face of the house like a blade. It was the kind of place no one really looked at twice. White siding faded to gray, porch lights swinging in the sea breeze blinds drawn too early in the afternoon. A patch of grass half dead. The mailbox leaned sideways, like it had stopped caring. Vincent was already outside when they arrived. He had the posture of a man recently disturbed from sleep, shoulders hunched, sweater hanging loose around his hips, hair matted like he'd dragged his hands through it too many times. The performance was precise. One officer, Sims, mid-40s. The kind of face you forget in minutes, stepped out first. The second, a younger woman named Patel, followed with a notepad in hand. Mr. Thorne Sims said. Vincent's voice cracked on cue. Have you found her? The question lingered, manufactured panic curling around the edges. Sims shook his head. That's what we're here about. Can we come inside? Vincent swallowed hard. Nodded. Held the door open like a grieving widower welcoming the undertaker. They passed into the living room, a place curated in shades of artificial warmth. Beige carpet brown couch, family photos arranged perfectly crooked. But there were no toys, no evidence a child had lived there. The air smelled faintly of bleach. Rachel stood outside on the walkway, arms folded across her chest. The cold bit through her blazer, but she didn't move. Her breath ghosted from her lips as she watched the windows. She could see him, Vincent's silhouette in the front room, gesturing, pacing, wiping his eyes with the heel of his hand. His back arched just enough to look like collapse. She had seen this act before, with different lines, different victims, but the eyes always gave it away. She'd seen them in battered women's shelters, in children's drawings tucked between math worksheets. The flatness, the calculation, the absence of shame. Inside, Patel asked the first question. When did you last see Maddie? Vincent exhaled hard. This morning, before I went to work. She was coloring at the table. She said she was going to draw me a picture of a boat. He gave a dry laugh. She always draws boats. Rachel closed her eyes for a moment. That was true. Maddie always drew boats, and horses, and sometimes boats carrying horses. She remembered one particular morning back in late April when Maddie had placed a folded piece of paper in her hand and whispered, "This is Thunder. He doesn't like the ocean, but he swims anyway." Rachel had taped that drawing to the inside of her desk drawer. Sim scribbled something down. And when you got home, she wasn't here. The door was locked, but her backpack was gone. Vincent's voice cracked. I thought maybe she went to a neighbor's. I called around, but no one's seen her. You didn't call us until nearly 3 hours later. I didn't want to overreact. I thought maybe she was just hiding or something. She does that sometimes when she's upset. Patel leaned forward slightly. What would she be upset about? Vincent blinked, just once, then pulled something from the side table, a piece of paper folded in half. I found this in her room. He handed it to Sims with the hesitation of a man offering a suicide note. Sims opened it slowly. Rachel couldn't see the words, but she didn't need to. She saw Patel's brow furrow. Sims' lips tighten. They believed it just enough to log it to enter it into evidence. Rachel turned away. Her fingers dug into her own forearms until she felt heat under the skin. 10 minutes later, the officer stepped back outside. Vincent followed, voice quieter now, expression perfectly wrecked. "If you hear anything," Sims said, "call immediately." Vincent nodded. "Of course. Please find her." Rachel didn't speak until they were halfway to the cars. Patel glanced back at the house. "He seems shaken." Rachel said nothing. "You don't think he is?" She turned then slowly, like the weight of the wind itself was holding her still. "I think he's rehearsed." Patel frowned. "Rehearsed?" Rachel looked past her to the horizon. The way he cried. The phrasing. And that note. She shook her head, voice low, taut as piano wire. Those weren't a child's words. And certainly not Maddie's handwriting. Sims opened the squad car. "You have something to back that up." "I taught her," Rachel snapped. "Every day for almost a year. I watched her draw horses with her left hand, tongue poking out the corner of her mouth, every loop jagged but wide. That note, right-handed narrow loops, no smudging. You don't unlearn how you hold a crayon overnight." Silence. Then Patel stepped forward, cautious. "Do you have any reason to believe she's in danger?" Rachel's jaw clenched. "Yes," she said quietly. "Because that man is made of masks." She drove away without another word. The car was silent, radio off. The only sound was the ticking of her turn signal and the occasional rush of wind as trucks passed on the highway. Her knuckles were white on the steering wheel. She didn't go home. Instead, she pulled into the back lot of the school, shut the engine off, and sat with the engine ticking itself cool. Her fingers fumbled into her coat pocket. Out came a chain, simple, tarnished. At the end of it, a tiny charm shaped like a horseshoe. Worn, scratched, but unmistakable. She remembered the day Maddie gave it to her, the last day of school before summer. Maddie had waited until the room was empty, then tiptoed over with her hands behind her back. She'd whispered for luck. "So you don't forget me." Rachel had laughed, teased her gently. "I couldn't forget you if I tried." But Maddie had just looked at her, serious. People forget horses all the time. And then she'd run off. Rachel held the charm tightly now, pressed it into her palm until the metal bit skin. No, she thought, she wouldn't forget. And she wouldn't let anyone else forget either, even if it meant dragging every secret Camden had tried to bury back into the light. Thunder stopped without warning. The sound of his hooves softened into silence as he reached the narrow pass between two towering rock faces, where the pines thinned and the salt in the air thickened. The trees here didn't sway. They twisted. The kind of twisting that came from centuries of wind carving against bone like stone. A place shaped by endurance, not mercy. This was no trail. It was a fracture in the mountain. Maddie clung to Thunder's back arms, wrapped loosely around his neck. She was too cold to shiver now, her body beyond protest. Her damp coat clung to her skin, heavy and useless, like armor made of wet paper. Thunder lowered his head and sniffed the wind. He stepped carefully, his front hoof testing the jagged ground before each move. Then he paused. Maddie blinked, her cheek lifting from the glossy mat of his mane. They had arrived. The gully ahead opened into a split of broken shale and lichen-covered stone. A sharp drop lay to the left, hidden by a cluster of leaning boulders, their sides polished smooth by years of relentless ocean mist rising from below. Thunder turned slightly, angling his body to shield her from the wind. Maddie tried to sit up straighter, but her spine screamed. She slid awkwardly from his back, landing on the uneven ground with a soft grunt. Her legs trembled. Her coat was soaked through, clinging like a second skin. She peeled it off the fabric, making a sickening squelch, and dropped it on a rock. The wind slammed into her chest. She gasped. Goosebumps crawled up her arms like ants. Her lips were purple, fingernails blue. The cold wasn't just a temperature now. It was a presence wrapping itself around her ribs, slipping into her throat. She wobbled. Thunder stepped forward, bent his head low, and nudged her back gently with his muzzle. Maddie stumbled, caught herself against his shoulder. He stayed still. His breath steamed against her skin. His body radiated heat, a furnace beneath a velvet curtain. Without hesitation, Maddie pressed herself into him, small fingers digging into his side, her face buried against his barrel chest. The wind screamed overhead, and then the rain came. Not soft, not polite. It hit like spit from a broken sky, sudden and violent. Within seconds, the rocks turned slick, and the soil between them oozed mud. Thunder shook once, power rippling through his body, then nudged Maddie again, this time leading her toward the wall of stone at the back of the gully. A small alcove, not a cave, but deep enough to matter. He pushed her gently beneath the overhang and stood half inside with her, shielding the rest of her from the storm with the breadth of his flank. Maddie collapsed into the dirt, her knees folding without ceremony. Her breathing was ragged. But she didn't cry. Instead, she scooped up a handful of wet earth, thick, dark, cold. With a single finger, she began to draw in it. Not pictures, not scribbles, shapes. One shape, over and over again. A hoof print, oval, deep, split down the center. Again and again, the same shape Thunder had pressed into the stone on the cliff. She didn't know why she did it, only that she needed it. Thunder watched. Then slowly, he stepped forward and planted his front hoof into the soft earth beside her. A real mark, right beside the ones she'd made with her hand. Maddie looked up. Their eyes met. No sound passed between them. But something, some agreement, some pact was made. Above them, the rain thundered against the rocks. Rachel stood beneath a leaking awning outside a photography studio that hadn't had its windows cleaned in 5 years. The hand-painted sign above the door read simply, Elijah Martin, black and silver photography. She checked her watch again. 10 a.m. She could hear her heartbeat. It had been years since she'd seen Elijah in person. He hadn't come to the town meeting in over 2 years. Didn't respond to emails. When his name came up, people spoke carefully. Brilliant but difficult, or sweet kid, just intense. He was 32 now, still lived with his mother, still spent most of his time walking the coastline alone, with a camera strapped to his chest and noise-canceling headphones over his ears. But Rachel remembered what others didn't. She remembered the way Elijah used to sit in the back of her classroom, coloring shadows behind every figure. She remembered how he'd named every bird in Maine before the 3rd grade, and how he once said, "I remember better with pictures than with words." She knocked. No answer. She knocked again, firmer. A voice from inside muffled, "Doors open." Rachel pushed inside. The air smelled like dust and fixer fluid. Light seeped in through old blinds, laying stripes across stacks of black and white prints. Elijah was at the far end of the room, hunched over a table filled with contact sheets and negatives, his hands moving with the precision of someone who didn't trust them yet. He wore a wool beanie and a hoodie that hung off one shoulder. He didn't look up. "Hi, Elijah," Rachel said softly. He flinched. His fingers stopped. Then slowly he turned. His eyes were sharp clear. Too clear. Like he saw everything at once and couldn't blink fast enough to stop it. "Rachel," he said. No smile, no surprise. Just her name spoken like a math equation. "I need your help." He raised one eyebrow. "I don't talk to people." "I know," she said. "But I'm not here for small talk." That seemed to intrigue him. He tilted his head. "I think something happened to one of my students." Elijah didn't move. "Her name is Maddie Thorne," Rachel continued. "She disappeared yesterday. Her stepfather's story doesn't add up. I think he hurt her. Or worse." Silence. Elijah's hands moved again. Shuffled through a pile of photos. Rachel glanced around. Every wall was covered in images. Coastlines, trees, fog, sky, and horses. Dozens of them. Wild, running, bleeding, staring. One photo in particular caught her breath. Thunder. You couldn't mistake him. The scar across his flank. The lightning-shaped groove in his hoof, visible as he reared up over a wave, crashing against a cliff. Rachel stepped closer. "This horse, he's real." Elijah nodded. "His name is Thunder. You've seen him." He looked up. "He finds people. He doesn't like being seen." Rachel turned to face him fully. "I think he found Maddie." Elijah didn't answer. He walked to a drawer, pulled out a sheet of photos time-stamped. "These were taken 3 days ago," he said. "Out by the southern cliffs. I was tracking gull migrations. But I saw hoofprints. On the rock." He held out the photos. Rachel stared. The prints were deliberate, too deep to be casual, patterned, directional. "They're not random," Elijah said. "He's leaving signals." She looked up at him. "Signals." He nodded once. "He's marking places, trails, warnings, maybe even maps." Rachel stared at the final photo. A single hoofprint in the center of the frame. Rain darkened, surrounded by nothing, but screaming at her just the same. It matched the charm in her pocket exactly. Where was this taken? Elijah pulled a folded topographical map from his drawer, pointed to a gully between 2 ridges. "Here, just above tide line. If she's with him, he's keeping her dry." Rachel didn't hesitate. She stepped toward the door. Elijah called after her, "I'll go with you." Rachel turned. He was already grabbing his camera and headphones. "I don't talk to people," he said again. "But I do talk to horses." Then he paused and added with no irony, "They listen better." And somewhere deep beneath that storm-ripped sky, inside a hollow of stone, Maddie pressed her hand into the dirt and again. Drew one last hoofprint beside Thunder's. This one deeper, darker, wider. Thunder didn't move, but for the first time he leaned into her. And in the heart of the storm, a wild thing let itself soften. Thunder didn't stop moving until the forest opened into memory. What remained of the old pasture came into view just past the thickets, a place time had tried to bury, but roots hadn't claimed. Rusted gates leaned inward like knees buckling. A single windmill turned on a creaking axis, its blades fractured and groaning with each slow rotation. Weeds swallowed fence posts, and the barn's roof sagged like a tired breath. But the silence, that was untouched. Maddie clutched Thunder's mane as he stepped over a fallen beam and ducked beneath the gaping arch of the abandoned barn. It was colder inside than out. Dust hung in the air like smoke after a fire that never burned. Long shafts of light pierced through holes in the wood, catching floating particles in golden suspension. The smell was sharp old metal-rotted hay, and something buried under both. Thunder exhaled. Maddie slid off his back again, her legs wobbly. She looked around, eyes wide, fingers brushing the walls like she expected them to crumble under her touch. Everywhere decay. But tucked under a collapsed shelf, something caught the light. She knelt, tugged gently, and pulled out a small brass bell cracked along one side tied to a faded leather cord. She didn't know how she knew, but she knew. This had once belonged to Thunder. The shape of it. The notch in the leather strap where something had chewed through. She looked at him. He looked back still as a photograph. Maddie turned the bell over in her hand, then touched the cord to the scar on his neck. It matched. She reached up, slowly touched the left side of her own neck. There beneath her collar, a faint line. She'd forgotten it, or maybe someone told her to forget. A burn once, a mistake, they said. But now, standing in this place, with this creature, she saw it differently. Not a mark, a memory. She looked into the broken mirror hanging askew in the corner. 2 reflections, 1 child, 1 horse, 2 scars, the same side, same curve. She didn't say anything, just touched the glass. In his studio, Elijah sat hunched under the soft blue glow of his monitor. Rachel paced behind him, arms crossed, tight breath short. The screen showed an old photo taken 3 years ago at an illicit auction that had taken place behind a shuttered casino south of Camden. Elijah had been there by accident, following a tip about cruelty violations in horse trading. He'd taken the photo in secret through a crack in the trailer wall. A horse black leaned wild-eyed, being led out in chains. A man in a trench coat behind him. Elijah zoomed in. The resolution pixelated, then clarified as he ran it through the software he'd built himself. Layers of light correction, shadow subtraction, contrast depth. Then paused. Rachel leaned in. The face behind the horse, no longer a blur. Vincent, smiling, watching Thunder being dragged into the light. Rachel's breath caught. It's him. Elijah nodded once, lips a straight line. He was there. You're sure this is Thunder? Elijah clicked. The next image was side-by-side comparison. Scar pattern, mane whorl, hoof shape. There's no mistake. Rachel's hands trembled. She leaned on the table. I need to get this to the chief, she whispered. Elijah didn't answer. Instead, he opened another folder. More images. Thunder in chains. Thunder in a pen surrounded by drunk men placing bets. Thunder lying in a stall, blood pooling beneath his leg. Each photo a quiet violence. Each image a confession no one had made. Maddie stepped further into the barn. Thunder stayed at the door, unmoving, but his ears rotated constantly, catching echoes Maddie couldn't hear. The floor creaked under her. She passed stalls once used for livestock, now home to mildew and cobwebs. At the back, a room once used as an office. She pushed the half-hinged door open with effort. Inside, a cot with ripped canvas, a rusted oil lamp, and photographs tacked to the far wall, curling at the edges, yellowed by time. Maddie moved closer. She couldn't read the scribbles beneath the photos, but she understood the pictures. Thunder, younger, thinner, terrified, tied to a post, muzzle bleeding. Another photo, him rearing as a man raised a whip. Another, him being branded. She stared, one after another, pain frozen in frames. And in every one, Vincent lingered somewhere in the corner, watching or smiling or walking away. In one image, Thunder stood nose to nose with a little girl who wasn't Maddie, her arms outstretched. The girl's face had been scratched out, but Thunder's face was clear, and so was the bruise under his eye. Maddie sat down hard on the floor. She didn't cry. Instead, she took the bell in her hand and rang it once. The sound was soft, broken, but it traveled. Thunder stepped inside the room. He didn't look at the photos. He looked at her, and for the first time, she spoke. A whisper. I remember. Thunder lowered his head until their foreheads touched. The silence between them filled with the weight of everything no one else had heard. At the police station, Rachel burst through the doors, laptop in hand. Elijah followed, shoulders tight, head down, camera bag thumping against his hip. Chief Walters looked up from his desk, surprised. Rachel. She didn't stop walking. I have evidence, she said. Visual. Firsthand. Vincent Thorne was involved in illegal animal trafficking, and there's reason to believe child trafficking as well. Walters raised his eyebrows. That's a big jump. She opened the laptop. The photo filled the screen. Vincent. Thunder. Auction. She clicked through the folder. Image after image. He sold this horse illegally. We believe he hurt Maddie. We believe he left her to die. And this, she pointed to the scar. This is your proof. Walters stared, then sighed. I'll need to get a warrant. No, Rachel said. You need to get a search team into the southern ridge past the second bluff. Elijah thinks that's where Thunder might have taken her. Wait. Walters frowned. You think the horse took the girl? Rachel's voice didn't waver. I know he did. Elijah finally spoke. Because she's the only one who listened. Walters blinked, then nodded once, and the manhunt began. In the barn, Maddie curled up beside Thunder in the corner of the room. The light from the broken window formed a halo across their shapes. She held the bell in one hand, the photo in the other. Thunder dozed, head resting against her leg, but even in his sleep his ears twitched, waiting for hoofbeats in the distance, waiting for someone to come. And for the first time in days, Maddie didn't feel lost. She felt found by the only one who remembered what it meant to be taken and to survive. Vincent sat alone in his workshop when the call came, a short static-filled message over a secured line. 2 words whispered between panic and disbelief. The horse. He didn't speak, didn't ask for clarification, didn't have to. Thunder was alive. The breath caught in his throat wasn't fear. It was rage. He had paid good money to make sure that beast disappeared. Watched it collapse, once bleeding from the flank, its screams swallowed by ocean wind. Watched the sea take it, or so he thought. Now the past was galloping back. He slammed his fist into the table tools, scattering like startled birds. A chisel clattered to the floor. His knuckles bled. Vincent moved fast. Within 30 minutes, 4 trucks rolled up to the dockside warehouse on the edge of town. The men who stepped out didn't wear uniforms, but they moved like they'd been trained to follow orders before questions. The name of the front was still printed in peeling letters across the door, Camden Equine Healing Project. Locals thought it was a rehab space for injured horses. They didn't know the basement stank of bleach and fear. That in the back room, children had once been made to sleep next to crates. Vincent opened the doors himself. The men filed in. One carried a bolt gun, another chains. A third flipped open a laptop, pulling up satellite footage. She's still with it, the man said. Kid's alive. Vincent didn't blink. Then we clean this up before sunrise. He looked at the map. Thunder had returned to the pasture, the one Vincent abandoned years ago after the last auction fell apart. The barn's old. Open from the south, one man said. No cameras. No neighbors, another added. Vincent's lips curled into a smile that never reached his eyes. Then we torch it. Rachel stood at the front desk of the sheriff's station, with Elijah behind her, his arms crossed over his chest like armor. The photo on the screen was undeniable. Vincent, Thunder, chains, blood. Auction date stamped in the corner. The deputy behind the desk squinted, unimpressed. Okay, so maybe the guy had a shady past. Doesn't mean he's behind a kidnapping. Rachel's voice was calm, but tight. It's not just shady. He's laundering child trafficking under an animal rescue license. I have records, financials, shipment manifests, contacts linked to 3 missing children reported last year. The sheriff, an older man with creased cheeks and a badge that hadn't been shined since Reagan stepped out of his office. He frowned. Rachel. She turned. I thought we talked about this kind of behavior. Her spine straightened. This isn't behavior. It's evidence. He sighed. You know how this looks, right? No. Explain it to me. You've been warned before about boundary issues with students, getting too emotionally involved. That hearing last year, that hearing was dropped, she snapped. Because the claim was baseless. The room stilled. The deputy looked away. The sheriff rubbed the back of his neck. I'm not saying I don't believe you. I'm saying we need more than a blurry photo and a theory to act on. She stepped forward, shaking with a fury she refused to show. This isn't a theory. This is a child, one of mine. The sheriff didn't flinch. You're not a teacher anymore. That landed like a punch. Elijah shifted behind her, his jaw clenched. Rachel looked at them both the way they stared just past her, not at her. She knew that look. She'd worn it years ago, when no one believed her. 1,000 cold mornings on the other side of a locked schoolroom door. The silence after bruises. The whispered apologies that never came. She turned without another word. Elijah followed. Outside, the sun was sinking behind a row of rusted roofs. The air smelled like sea salt and gasoline. Rachel stood beside her car, not moving. Now what Elijah asked. She looked at him, eyes steady. We find them ourselves. They drove in silence through the edge of Camden, headlights off. Elijah held the camera on his lap, switching between thermal mode and night vision. Rachel gripped the wheel like it was the only thing keeping her tethered to gravity. Maddie's charm. The little horseshoe hung from the mirror, swaying with every bump in the road. Rachel caught its motion out of the corner of her eye, and then she saw it. In the dirt ahead, faint, barely visible in the dying light. A print, hoof-shaped, pressed deep into the edge of the shoulder. She pulled over. Elijah jumped out before she'd even turned off the engine. Another print 10 feet ahead, and another. Rachel walked after them, the chill slicing through her coat. The trail turned off-road into the scrub brush and overgrown logging paths that hadn't seen tires in years. "This is Thunder," Elijah said. "You sure?" He nodded. He drags his left hind hoof. "Scar tissue. It leaves a smudge here," he pointed, "not clean like the others." Rachel crouched beside the print. Her fingers hovered over it, then pressed down. The dirt was still warm. They were close. Vincent's trucks crested the ridge, overlooking the pasture, their headlights cutting swaths through the darkness like searchlights. Inside the barn, Thunder jerked his head up. Maddie felt it before she saw it, the tension that moved through his body like electricity. She pressed against his side, then heard it too. Engines, doors slamming, footsteps. Thunder bolted upright. Maddie grabbed the bell. The pictures shoved them into her coat pocket. Thunder reared once, hooves pounding the dirt floor. Outside men circled the barn with flashlights. The one with the bolt gun nodded. "We end this quick." Vincent stepped forward, pulling on gloves. "I want them both." Inside, Thunder positioned himself between Maddie and the door. She crouched low, heart hammering. She didn't cry. She didn't scream. She listened, the way Thunder had listened to her, the way Rachel had listened. And she waited. Back on the trail, Rachel and Elijah heard the first engine growl, less than half a mile away. Then the flicker of flame, a glow on the horizon. Rachel didn't ask. She ran. Branches clawed at her arms. Rocks tore at her boots. But she didn't stop, not until the smell of smoke hit her like a wave. The barn was in view now. The pasture lit orange. Figures moving like shadows in a nightmare. Thunder's scream, raw, wild, full of something ancient and bottomless, pierced the night. And Rachel ran harder. The wind howled through the bones of the barn like a final warning. Flames crawled fast, eager up the dry beams, soaked in the dust of forgotten years. Smoke billowed low, thick, and yellow, curling around the walls and licking at the floorboards. Maddie couldn't move. The fallen timber pinned her left leg, splintered wood pressing into flesh. She reached for Thunder, her voice hoarse. "Help, Thunder, please." Outside, men shouted. Inside, the air was cracking with heat. Thunder didn't hesitate. He spun, hooves slicing the ground, fire reflecting in his eyes like war drums. The black of his coat shimmered red-orange in the blaze. He reared once, high, defiant, then slammed his hooves down, cracking the earth. The first man through the door didn't see it coming. A single kick sent the lantern he was holding flying, smashing against a pile of straw behind him. The fire exploded. A wall of flame shot up to the rafters. Screams rang out. The other men stumbled back, blinded by heat and smoke. But Vincent kept walking, straight through the smoke, through the fire, through the screaming. His coat burned at the edges. In his hand, a knife. Its edge long curved, familiar. He had used it before. He would use it again. His eyes locked onto the black stallion. Thunder didn't move. He stood between Vincent and Maddie, body as shield legs planted the long scar on his neck, catching firelight like a sigil. Vincent paused, then smiled. "You're still breathing," he whispered. Thunder growled low in his throat. Not a whinny, not a neigh. Something ancient, something vengeful. Vincent raised the knife, took a step forward, and another, then lunged. Steel flashed. Maddie screamed. The blade sliced across Thunder's chest deep. The stallion reared, blood sprang across the floor. But he didn't fall. He didn't flinch. He stepped forward. One, then two. And then in a sudden burst, he charged. The weight of his body slammed into Vincent's chest like a storm breaking. The man flew backward, crashing into the remains of a stall. Dust and flame burst upward. The knife clattered to the ground. Thunder staggered just once and turned to Maddie. She was coughing now, face pale, fingers clawing at the beam across her leg. "Please," she choked. Thunder lowered his head, bit down on the timber, pulled once, twice. The wood creaked. He pulled harder. Muscles trembled. Blood poured down his chest in rivers. Finally, the beam cracked. Maddie dragged herself out, sobbing. She reached for his neck, clung to him. Thunder leaned into her. Behind them, Vincent groaned, reaching for the knife again. Thunder turned. He didn't hesitate. He moved forward, slow, deliberate. Vincent lifted the blade, face twisted. But he was too late. Thunder kicked. A single strike. Straight to the shoulder. The bone snapped. Vincent screamed, the knife flying into the flames. He collapsed, arm limp, coughing black smoke. Sirens howled in the distance. Maddie looked to the door. Fire everywhere. No way out. But Thunder knew. He turned, pushed her gently with his nose toward the back of the barn, the stable doors partially open. She limped, dragging her leg, leaning on him. Every step was agony. Thunder pushed harder. Behind them, beams collapsed. Sparks rained like burning snow. They reached the doors. Thunder burst through, first clearing the path. Maddie followed, collapsing to the grass, just beyond the threshold. The night air hit her lungs like water. She coughed, cried, laughed all at once. Rachel was there, running, screaming. She fell to her knees, wrapped Maddie in her arms. Elijah appeared beside her, snapping photos in every direction, the flames, the wreckage, the man crawling through the fire. But Rachel saw none of it, only the blood pouring from Thunder's chest. She dropped to the ground beside him. No, stay with me, Thunder." His legs trembled. He sank slowly. Rachel pressed her hands to the wound. Maddie touched his nose. "Don't go," she whispered. "Please." Thunder blinked slowly, then exhaled. Not a cry, not a roar, just breath. And somehow it was louder than the fire behind them. Vincent was dragged from the wreckage moments later, handcuffed, bleeding, screaming about devils and ghosts and horses that refused to die. Rachel didn't turn to look. She kept her hands on Thunder's chest, praying, pleading. And as the first drop of rain fell from the smoke-filled sky, Thunder breathed again. The smoke was visible from 3 miles away. Orange bled into the night sky like a second sunset, one born not of beauty, but of something burning to be seen. It pulsed over Camden's cliffs like a beacon of reckoning. In the distance, sirens rose, tangled in wind. Rachel didn't wait for permission. She sprinted toward the barn, past the sheriff's truck and the first responders, who still hadn't made sense of the report. Her boots slid in the wet grass. Ash fell like snow, staining her coat with ghosts. Elijah followed, camera clutched to his chest like an artifact. Behind them, headlights multiplied, police cruisers, news vans, volunteers. But no one moved faster than Rachel. She saw the fire. And then she saw Thunder collapsed, his body steaming in the rain, blood soaking the soil like ink into old paper. And Maddie curled against his neck, her tiny arms clinging like vines to something ancient and broken, and still somehow unbroken. Rachel dropped to her knees. The girl didn't cry. Her face was covered in soot and tears and blood. Her hands, shaking, were stained red. "Maddie," Rachel whispered, reaching out. Maddie looked up. Her eyes were hollow and wide and full of something no 5-year-old should carry. She didn't move away, but she didn't move toward Rachel either. She just said one word, "Help him!" Rachel's throat caught. Thunder's eyes fluttered. Another breath, shallow. One leg kicked once, then stopped. Paramedic Rachel screamed over her shoulder. "He's losing too much." A voice cut through the smoke. "He's not human, Rachel," the sheriff said, stepping forward. "We treat the girl first." Rachel spun. He saved her. Elijah stood beside her, camera already recording. "And I have proof." The sheriff frowned. "Proof?" Elijah pulled out his phone. A video, grainy, chaotic, of Thunder standing over Maddie, in the flames, shielding her from Vincent. The camera had captured it all, the knife, the blood, the final charge. And now it was online, already spreading. Rachel's phone buzzed. One notification, then 10, then hundreds. The truth was out. Too late to silence. Too loud to deny. Vincent, still writhing on the grass in cuffs, screamed at the flashing lights. "You don't know what you're doing." "That thing. He's not natural. He's... But no one was listening anymore. Cameras turned on him. Reporters barked questions. Police shoved mics aside, dragging other men from the shadows, his crew, the handlers, the volunteers from the fake healing center. Some fought, some wept. One begged for a lawyer, another begged for his mother, but none of them begged for forgiveness. And above it all, the horse bled in silence. Maddie hadn't let go, not even when the medics lifted her. They wrapped a blanket around her shoulders, but her fists still gripped Thunder's mane. "He won't let me go," she whispered. "It's okay, sweetheart," a medic said. "We'll take care of him." But Maddie's eyes locked onto Rachel. "Promise," she said. Rachel knelt beside her again, pressing a hand to Thunder's neck. "I promise." Maddie nodded once. Then finally, she allowed herself to be lifted. Her arms didn't fall to her sides. They stayed frozen in that shape, like she was still holding him, even when she wasn't. By morning, the barn was ash. News trucks lined the edge of the field like vultures too full to feed. The Camden Gazette ran the headline, "Wild Horse Saves Child from Trafficking Ring," in thick block letters. But the townspeople, those who knew the shape of the pain long buried, read between the lines. Rachel stood near the edge of the pasture beside Elijah, watching Thunder through the fence. The vet had done what she could. The wound was deep. He hadn't stood up again, but he was alive, breathing, waiting. "I uploaded the full video," Elijah said quietly. "It's everywhere now." Rachel didn't reply. She was watching Maddie. The girl stood in the field with bare feet, bandages up one leg, the bell tied loosely around her wrist. She didn't speak. She just pressed her forehead against Thunder's, both of them still. A perfect stillness. And in that moment, Rachel saw it. The blood on the girl's hands. Still there. Not cleaned. Not washed away. Because it wasn't just Thunder's blood. It was hers too. Her history. Her wound. Her survival. It marked her as witness. Marked her as kin. She wasn't holding on to trauma. She was holding on to truth. Camden changed. Not loudly. Not overnight. But truth has a way of echoing. The old equine center was razed. The lot became a memorial garden. No plaque. No statue. Just wild grass, open sky, and the sound of hooves far off in the morning mist. The mayor, who had once vouched for Vincent, resigned quietly. Half the town council was investigated. The children who had disappeared, some were found. Not all, but some, and their names were painted across the seawall in bold blue letters just above the tide line. Thunder never returned to the wild, but he was never caged either. He remained in that field, free to leave, free to stay. He stayed, but only because Maddie stayed too. And every dawn, just before the light turned gold, he walked to the edge of the fence and stared out at the ocean. Not trapped, not tame, but watchful. Elijah's final photo of the sequence didn't show fire, didn't show blood. It was of a child standing in a field beside a horse. Both their heads bowed toward each other, eyes closed. Silent, unbroken, and behind them, nothing but sky. The courtroom was silent. Vincent stood in his suit pressed clean sterile. But his eyes were gone, swallowed by weeks without power. His hands trembled behind his back, not from guilt, but from knowing it was over. The judge read each charge slowly. Child endangerment, illegal trafficking, fraud, animal cruelty, conspiracy, perjury. Each word like a nail sealing a coffin. Rachel sat just behind the prosecution table. Her back was straight, her hands folded. But her chest rose and fell with a steady pulse. Not anger, not vengeance, but completion. She didn't need to watch Vincent break down. She needed to watch him end. When the bailiff asked him to speak, Vincent didn't look up. No apology, no protest. Just a whisper through clenched teeth. "I should have finished the job." Gasps rippled through the room. But Rachel didn't move. She simply leaned closer to Maddie, who sat beside her small legs, swinging above the floor hands, clutching the little brass bell. The clapper had long since broken, but she still carried it. Like a vow, the gavel fell. Life sentence, no parole. The silence after was louder than the verdict. In the press conference 2 days later, Elijah stood next to the governor as cameras flashed. His coat was wrinkled tie crooked, but he looked like himself. One hand in his pocket, the other holding the same camera he had used to tear down an entire network. The metal around his neck was simple silver, shaped like a flame. "Citizenship in the face of fear," the plaque read. He said nothing during the ceremony, but afterward, when a reporter asked what motivated him, he looked straight into the lens and said, "People always think silence protects them. But sometimes silence is the loudest kind of violence." Then he walked off stage. Rachel was reinstated, not just as a teacher, as someone the town finally had to see. The school board apologized publicly, issuing a full retraction of the past accusations. One member offered to resign. Rachel refused to gloat. Instead, she asked to teach a class on media literacy and trauma-informed support. It filled up in 2 hours. The children, once told to stay away from her, now waited outside her door each morning. Some brought her hand-drawn cards. Others brought questions. Maddie didn't return to public school, but she visited often, sometimes sitting in the corner, sketching quietly. Other times just watching. She was healing. But healing doesn't mean forgetting. The adoption was quiet. No fanfare. No streamers. Just a desk, 2 chairs, and a notary with soft eyes. Rachel signed the final paper with a pen. Maddie had chosen purple glittery with a charm at the end. When they stepped out into the sunlight, Rachel knelt and said, "You're mine now." Maddie shook her head. "No," she whispered. "You're mine too." They stood that way for a while. 2 figures the world had tried to cut down, now growing in directions no one had prepared for. Thunder had recovered, slowly, painfully. The gash across his chest became a pale scar. His coat regrew over it, but never fully. The hair there was coarse, uneven. He walked grazed, slept, but he never let anyone ride again. Not Elijah, not the vet, not even Rachel. Until the day Maddie stepped into the pasture barefoot, in the dew-soaked grass, wind lifting the ends of her coat like wings. She didn't speak, just approached slowly, belt tied around her wrist. Thunder watched her. He didn't move, not until she pressed her hand against his neck. Then slowly with weight, he lowered himself to one knee. Maddie climbed up without urgency, settled against his back, and they stood there, unmoving for a long time. The cliffs of Camden, once known only to fishermen and ghost stories, were different now. Where the first hoofprint had been found, they installed a single bronze plaque, small and unadorned. It read, "The first hoofprint, where hope rose." No names, no dates, just a quiet space for people to stand and feel whatever they needed to. Sometimes survivors came, other times just strangers. And often, early in the morning, Maddie and Thunder would be seen there, standing at the edge, looking out toward the sea. Not to forget, but to remember differently. To reclaim something the tide once tried to take, and failed. The grass parted in waves under Thunder's hooves, each step a rhythm that had come to define the mornings of Camden. Sunlight stretched across the fields, like liquid fire, golden and vast, washing over the back of the black stallion. It turned his scarred coat into a banner of defiance, dark silk streaked with flame. Maddie sat atop him, her legs no longer dangling too short, her posture not perfect, but proud. She didn't hold reins. Thunder didn't need them. He moved because she asked with her breath, because she leaned ever so slightly in a direction, and he followed the memory of what they had survived. The school building came into view. Children waited at the fence, already pointing. Not out of fear, but reverence. "Here she comes," someone whispered. Maddie dismounted with the ease of routine. The bell around her wrist still swung gently. Some kids touched it in passing like a talisman. Others just smiled. Rachel stood on the steps. She no longer taught from a textbook. Behind her, a new wing had been built, warm wood open space, gentle colors. A sign above read, "The Thunder Path, Center for Healing and Voices Once Lost." Inside were rooms without locks, journals with blank pages, counselors who listened, art supplies, music. hoofprints carved into the floor leading from room to room. It had become a haven for children with shadows in their lungs and stories stuck between ribs. And Camden had changed too. What was once whispered was now spoken aloud. A town once defined by fishing quotas and fog now held monthly fundraisers for the Horse and Child Fund, a statewide effort to provide therapy housing and animal-assisted recovery for abandoned and abused kids. No one remembered who started it. Maybe it was the mayor's widow. Maybe it was the sheriff's niece. But everyone agreed. The first check came with no name, only a drawing of a hoofprint in the shape of a heart. Maddie's book came out in late spring. She called it Hoofprints on Stone. No author photo, no dedication, just a single sentence on the first page. Some stories are carved by silence and made sacred by survival. It became required reading in schools across the state. One librarian said she found a student crying in the aisle between shelves, clutching the book like a memory. When asked why, the student said, "It's the first time I didn't feel crazy." Maddie didn't tour for it, didn't sign copies. She just kept writing, because the words weren't for applause. They were for thunder. Every morning before the school bell rang, before Rachel opened the center, before the town stirred itself into coffee and routine thunder climbed the cliff. No one knew when he started doing it. He would rise early, walk alone, and stand at the edge of the rock where he once found Maddie, the place where the ocean nearly swallowed her and where he had chosen to defy instinct. He never stayed long, just enough for the wind to lift through his mane, just enough for the gulls to circle once overhead. And always, just before he turned away, he'd stomp his hoof once against the stone. It left no mark, but everyone said they could hear it. A soft echo, a memory being kept alive, a refusal to forget. Years later, a reporter returned to Camden for a retrospective. He asked Rachel what kept her here. She pointed to the cliffs. "There's something about places where terrible things happened," she said. "If we can plant something healing there, it grows differently. Stronger." He asked Maddie if she still rode. She smiled and said, "No one rides thunder? He just lets me come with him." And when he asked Elijah if he'd ever take another photo as important as the ones he took that night, Elijah didn't answer. He just handed over a print. It was Maddie, aged maybe 11, now sitting beside Thunder in the field. Not mounted, just sitting, both facing away from the camera, both looking toward the sea. And below the image, in delicate cursive, was a single caption. Not tamed, not taken, just free. Thunder never grew docile, never let the world forget he was once wild. He bore his scars with pride, both the ones across his flesh and the ones pressed into memory. And though he never galloped like before, never raced storms or broke fences, he became something more sacred. A witness, a survivor, a symbol. And Maddie, she never tried to own him, only to honor him, only to walk beside him, wherever his hoofprints chose to fall next. And each time they passed the bronze plaque at the cliff's edge, the one that read, "The first hoofprint," where hope rose, Maddie would touch her fingers to the stone, and Thunder would stop, just for a second, just long enough to remember what it meant, not to be saved, but to survive, together.